Welcome, everyone. Welcome in. We're just going to give folks another minute or so to join as people are trickling in. And while people are trickling in, I'll use this opportunity to send some housekeeping information into our chat. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Give folks another minute and then we can get started. All right. I see more folks trickling in. Welcome. All right. I think we've got critical mass, so we can go ahead and get started. Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on the B Lab V2 standards. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, especially if you are on the West Coast like me, joining us first thing in the morning for what should be hopefully an interesting discussion. I'll be kicking us off with some introductions, give you a sense of what to expect over the next 45 minutes, and then we will dive into the content. And just some housekeeping items to make sure we're all on the same page. The first is that the webinar is being recorded. It will be sent out to attendees in the next couple of days. So um, you'll have that for your reference. The second is we will have some time set aside at the end for Q&A. Throughout today's webinar, if you do have any questions, you can use the Q&A function, which should be kind of next to the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to send Q&A there throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And lastly, there will be one quick poll that we'll leverage towards the end of the webinar, and we really encourage your input. It will help us a lot with understanding kind of what content will be most useful to you. So thank you in advance for your participation there. All right. I also, before we really begin, I want to introduce Attendees for those who are not familiar. Attendees is a certified B Corp sustainability and climate strategy consulting firm with headquarters in North America, the UK, and the EU, serving over 200 global clients. And we help our clients with a variety of services, including preparation for B Corp certification. And you can see the wide array of other offerings that we work on kind of sampled here on this slide, but we do things like materiality assessments, greenhouse gas emissions accounting, target setting, transition plans, and carbon offsetting strategies, just to name a few. Next, I'll introduce myself and my co-host so you know kind of who's speaking to you today and who you're talking to. So my name is Samantha Weinberg, and I'm a manager at Agendi in our San Francisco Bay Area office. I've got over a decade of experience working both as a consultant for Fortune 500 companies as well as in-house championing emissions reductions efforts. I specialize in supporting clients across the full spectrum of their sustainability journeys, helping them align with global reporting frameworks like the B Lab standards. And I also volunteer and currently serve as the events and education co-chair of Be Local Bay Area. So if you're also in the Bay Area, would love to see you at Be Local events coming up. I'll be hosting the webinar today and managing our Q&A. And I'm joined by my colleague, who I'm very excited to have with me today, Yumi Tong, who is a senior consultant with Agendi based in our London office. And she's a senior, excuse me, she has extensive experience in climate strategy, greenhouse gas accounting, and corporate sustainability reporting, and she works with global organizations to translate complex sustainability requirements into practical business-focused solutions. So really excited to be joined by her today and to speak to all of you. To give you a sense of what we're going to be covering today, an overview of our contents, we're going to do very quick discussion of the certification process to become a B Corp, just to kind of level set in case folks are not familiar with what that process looks like. We'll talk about the evolution of the B Lab standard, sort of how did we get to the version that we're working off of today, and then we'll dive a little deeper into those V2 standards, what's in them, what's asked of companies going through the certification process. And then we'll get to B Corp certification in practice, which is sort of Attendees process for how we support companies through that. And we'll wrap up with that Q&A that I mentioned. So without further ado, we can dive right in, and I will hand it over to Yimli, who will talk through the B Corp certification process.
Thanks, Samantha. Brilliant. So before we look at the process and the changes introduced by V2, it's worth briefly reminding ourselves why B Lab has introduced this new framework. So as existing B Corps, you'll likely already be familiar with the purpose of certification and know that B Corp recognizes organizations meeting the high standards of social and environmental performance. However, we know the context in which businesses operate has evolved significantly, with increasing expectations from customers, regulators, and other stakeholders, alongside much greater scrutiny of sustainability claims. So in response, what is expected of organizations is to increasingly demonstrate impact through not only clear standards, but also objective evidence and independent assurance. So the B Lab V2 standards has really been developed to meet these expectations. And we do this by introducing clearer, more consistent requirements, mandatory performance across key impact topics, and of course, a more robust independent assurance process. And together, these changes really aim to strengthen the alignment with evolving regulations such as the EU ECGT, as well as other global sustainability frameworks. And underpinning this is B Lab's theory of change, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, where the ambition shifts from merely looking at certifying individual organizations to really raising the standard for businesses more broadly. And they do this by driving systems change through collective action. So with that context in mind, we can switch to looking at how the certification process itself has changed. So the journey is presented as a series of stages, although it's helpful to think of it as a continuous process that extends beyond achieving certification. It follows 4 key stages. It's got registration, scoping, self-assessment, independent assurance, and then ongoing maintenance. So at the start of the journey, we begin with registration scoping. So this is quite plainly where organizations will register on B Impact, provide your information on your organization, and this will help ultimately set your certification scope. So this includes things like confirming your eligibility, completing legal requirements and risk profile, and this will determine which impact topic requirements will apply to your organization. Now, once that's complete, organizations move into the self-assessment stage. So that's stage 2. Here, what you do is you assess yourself against the applicable impact topic requirements. You'll be compiling, uploading the supporting objective evidence, and then identifying any gaps. And at the end of this, you'll be submitting your assessment for review. And once submitted, organizations then move to the independent assurance stage or the audit stage. And this is one of the most significant changes highlighted under the V2 standards. So rather than when before we were relying primarily on self-assessment, in V2, every organization now undergoes an independent audit by an approved assurance provider. This assurance provider is assigned by B Lab themselves, and they will be the one who are reviewing the assessment, evaluating your uploaded evidence, and also highlighting and identifying any non-conformities that will need to be addressed before certification can be awarded. And just a flag here is where non-conformities are identified at this stage, depending on whether they're major or minor, organizations will be required to address these through corrective actions, either before or alongside certification. And then lastly, we know that certification isn't the end of the journey. Organizations will move then into the maintenance stage. Certification will be valid for 5 years, and along those 5 years, there will be ongoing surveillance as well. So this continual improvement approach is, again, another one of the biggest emphasis under version 2. And it's also something we'll come back to later, where we look at how organizations should practically prepare for certification. And the certification process under these new standards is estimated to take around 2 to 6 months, and of course will vary depending on your company size and the number of major nonconformities that arise throughout the audit process. So with that high-level understanding of the certification process in mind, I'll pass on to Samantha, where we can turn our attention to the V2 standards themselves and the key changes you'll need to understand.
Great. Thank you. So, um, want to talk briefly about sort of the evolution of the B Lab standards, how we got to V2 before we dive into what's in those standards. So really, over the course of the past 20 years, since we are celebrating 20 years this year for B Lab and B Corps, standards have been reviewed and updated continuously. It's been a process where there have been regular updates made, but this, of course, marks sort of the biggest shift in the standards over time. You can see that in the naming conventions that were chosen, right? Going from uh, calling it V1.6 to now V2.2, which is the version that we're working off of. And this quote here from B Lab is kind of underpinning this change, right? They're trying to establish a stronger, more transparent foundation for all businesses committed to building an inclusive, equitable, and regenerative global economy. And in my view, there are sort of three key things that were part of this shift, this evolution that sort of brought us to the version of the standards that we're working off of now in V2.2. And the first is around clearer requirements. If anyone has read the standards document, the body of knowledge, it's over 1,000 pages long. It is very specific in terms of what is being asked of different companies that are trying to certify. And the evolution of the standards is and the updates made are really about making sure companies truly understand what's being asked of them, what's expected of them in order to be certified as a B Corp. The second is around global alignment. So, as Yemi mentioned, there are a lot of things that have shifted in the context in which we're operating, right? Other frameworks, other regulations that are evolving alongside B Lab and B Corp certification, and making sure that the standards are continuously aligned with what else is happening is critical to making sure that the certification makes sense for businesses and that anything that we're doing for B Corp certification kind of also is in lockstep with what's happening with regulations in jurisdictions where companies are operating. And the last is that piece on collective impact, right? Previously, the V1.6 standards, that process for certification, it was about individual points performance of an organization going through the certification process. And really, this is about raising the bar, thinking about the moment that we're in time where you know, B Corps as a collective have the opportunity to have a really significant collective impact. And so, how do we all kind of, change the nature of um, the economy? How do we change the nature of kind of how companies can operate together? So thinking about moving towards that collective impact is really underpinning the shifts that we see in the V2 standards. So this is sort of all the impetus for the evolution and the change. But in terms of the actual specific differences that you're going to see between the V1.6 and the V2.2 standards, there are a number of them, and I want to highlight some of the key ones here. So first, you've got the scoring model. As I mentioned, for V1.6, it was a points-based system. You had a series of questions to respond to that were scored. You needed to get your individual score back, and as long as you hit a minimum threshold of points, you were able to be certified. Now in V2.2, it's a requirements-based system. That means it's pass-fail. You either meet the requirements or you don't, and you have to meet all of the ones that are applicable to your business. If not, you'll get flagged for the nonconformities, as Yemi was mentioning in that audit process. And so there's a little bit less flexibility in some sense, right? Because before, if you scored poorly in one area but great in another, they kind of evened out and you could still hit your minimum threshold to be certified. And now you do need to hit all the requirements that are applicable to your business under the 2.2 standards. The next is on the impact topics. B Corp certification has always been really holistic in terms of the different aspects it's looking at, the things that it's trying to understand about a business in order to be certified, right? Under V1.6, there were five different impact areas, and there was a lot of nuance to those. But it's kind of gone even further in V2.2. We now have foundation requirements and seven different impact topics, and we'll spend a bit of time talking about kind of what exactly is asked of a company across each of these. But it's sort of covering even more in terms of the breadth of the topics that are included in the standards now. The next is on that assessment method, as we mentioned. So it went from self-assessment to now independent third-party verification. It's going to be a little bit more rigorous in terms of what that looks like to go through certification, to have someone kind of validate all of the evidence that you're providing, that you are meeting the requirements that are relevant to your business, responding to nonconformities, making sure that you have everything you need in order to kind of pass that third-party assessment process. And last is on the certification cycle. V1.6 had a certification cycle of 3 years. So every 3 years, you had to go back through the certification process. And with V2.2, it's now moved to every 5 years. So they've made the standards a little bit more rigorous, a little bit more stringent in some ways, but they've also lengthened the certification cycle so you have more time between each recertification. So just to give you that, again, quick overview of some of the key differences between V1.6 and V2. If you've already gone through a certification process under V1.6, right, this is going to look pretty different, just given the number of changes, not just in terms of what's asked of businesses, but also just the structure of the standards themselves, the process by which you need to certify that we walked through. So it will feel quite different. So to dive a little bit deeper into what exactly is in the V2 standards, what's being asked of businesses trying to become B Corp certified, as I mentioned, there are the foundation requirements and then seven impact topics that you can see here. You've got climate action, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, government affairs and collective action, purpose and stakeholder governance, environmental stewardship and circularity, fair work, and human rights. So as you can see, it is covering a lot. There are a number of topics here that can really include so many different things. And B-Lab has shared a significant amount of documentation about what is required, what they mean for each requirement, resources to better understand how to comply with the requirements. So I do encourage folks to take a look at that. If there are any pieces of this that you're feeling unsure what certain things mean or what's expected of you, they have put out a great body of knowledge through their Knowledge Hub and through the standards themselves to help support businesses going through the process. But to give you a snapshot of what is in each of these sort of 8 buckets, I'll walk through them. I could probably do like an hour plus webinar on each of these topics. So I won't have time to necessarily get super in the weeds on any one of them today, but that's one of the things we'll want to hear from, which are ones you'd want to, know more about. So if you have thoughts on that as I'm talking through it, keep that in mind for the poll at the end of today's session. So the first is the foundation requirements. This is really laying the groundwork for going through the certification process and tackling the other impact topics. Um, this is really that first step before you get to the other impact topics. This is about making sure you're meeting the eligibility criteria, the legal requirement, and this is also where you would be creating a risk profile using B Lab's risk tool to help understand if it triggers kind of any specific requirements under the remaining impact topics based on your business. So this is really about kind of getting yourself set up before you tackle the seven impact topics. That's why I sort of kind of separate and distinct. This is a first step, and then you sort of get to the seven impact topics that I'm about to talk about. Next, we've got climate action, and really this is about having companies work towards limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius through a variety of actions. Some key things to highlight here are, in terms of differences to the V1.6 requirements, is that depending on the size of the business you are, which I'll get more in the weeds on that as well in a moment. You might now be required to measure your emissions, whereas in V1.6, there were questions on emissions measurement. Were you doing it? What are they? But if you weren't doing that and you still scored sufficient points, you could continue to be certified as a B Corp. Now, if you're a large, an extra large, or a double XL sized company, you have to measure emissions, get them third party validated through assurance, and set emissions reductions targets. So it is a big shift in terms of the actual asks if you are a larger company. Especially, but just in general, right? Some of the things that were maybe included in V1.6 are now sort of mandatory as opposed to ultimately optional as long as you scored enough points under the previous version of the standards. So, um, good thing to highlight there. Next, we've got justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is really about asking companies to make sure that they're measuring differences between groups, gathering feedback from stakeholders, and then implementing targeted actions to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. JEDI, as it's called, is really unique in terms of the way that this impact topic is structured because um, this allows for some amount of tailoring to things that make sense to your business. Based on your business, there are going to be certain asks about the number and type of targeted actions you're taking to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And BLAB in the standards provides 19 options for actions that company can take, and you can kind of decide which are the most appropriate based on the data that you're collecting as part of this, the stakeholder feedback you're gathering, and make sure that you're just kind of hitting the appropriate requirements. But some examples of what you could be asked to do in terms of a JEDI action would be committing publicly to JEDI principles, implementing inclusive hiring practices, or making sure your company's website meets accessibility standards. So it kind of, again, it covers a wide variety of topics, and you need to make sure that you're hitting your requirements and choosing the ones that are most appropriate to your business. Next, we've got government affairs and collective action. This is really about how companies engage with external stakeholders. So this is things like obviously collective action, but also lobbying and responsible tax practices. This is something that might feel a little bit new relative to what you've seen in V1.6 standards if you're not familiar. And it's really, again, going back to that concept of how the B Corp community can have a collective impact. How do we work together to sort of change the way in which the world operates in a more positive direction? So again, like Jedi, there's actually a number of options you can select from in terms of what counts as collective action, and you can choose what kind of makes most sense for your company. Some examples would be mentorship, thought leadership, public policy advocacy. So really just needing to think through what makes the most sense for your business and how you can ensure that you're meeting the requirements. Next, we've got purpose and stakeholder governance. So this is really about how you would embed purpose into your governance and your operations through a number of different mechanisms. And this is really about how everything kind of all comes together as a B Corp in my mind, right? If you're taking all these other actions, how do you make sure it's embedded in the governance systems and structures of your organization? Um, and how do you make sure you're reporting transparently on the work that you're doing? The other thing I'll flag here that's maybe key to know, especially if you are a large XL or double XL company, is that there is a requirement for conducting a materiality assessment and also doing public sustainability reporting. So again, there's a number of different asks here, especially if you are a larger company. The other thing I'll flag here that's maybe a little bit different from the V1.6 standards is this also includes requirements for responsible marketing and public relations, which is maybe new for some folks who have not necessarily thought about this before. So something to maybe take a closer look at if you've not necessarily considered what your responsible marketing practices look like at your business. Next, we'll get to environmental stewardship and circularity. And this is really about how you are thinking about sustainable resource use, how you're thinking about circular design and circularity, and just overall taking meaningful action to minimize any negative environmental impacts that your business might have. So this is asking for some of the key data that was asked for in V1.6, like energy consumption, water use, waste. But then it's also asking companies to have a strategy to address the negative impacts and take action to mitigate the negative impacts on the environment. And this is looking at direct operations, but also things like your supply chains, how you're thinking about this in your procurement decision making, right? So, again, it kind of goes a step further in terms of thinking through not just are you gathering the data, but then how are you using that data to make informed decisions about minimizing the negative impact of your business on the environment. Then we've got fair work, which is really making sure that companies are improving workplace culture and ensuring all workers are treated fairly and with dignity. Um, Again, this is going to sort of be a step up from the V1.6 requirements if you're familiar. So this asked in V1.6, it asked, for example, for a percent of employees being paid a living wage in your workforce. In the V2.2 requirements, for year three, there's a requirement that the company pays all employees a living wage using a living wage estimate that's approved by B Lab. So again, it has similar elements to what's asked for in the V1.6 requirements, but it sort of is taking it that step further, making it a requirement, not just kind of understanding, do you have this data? Are you collecting this data? Is this something you're working towards? But something that is sort of that pass-fail requirement, as I mentioned. And last but certainly not least is the human rights impact topic. So this is, of course, about companies committing to respecting human rights, but it's also about addressing salient human rights issues and having those identified. And depending on your size and sector, also sharing what those salient human rights issues are publicly. So, again, this is something where maybe you've considered this before, but based on the type of company you have, you could be kind of asked to sort of, again, sort of take it to the next step in terms of what is asked of you and how you manage your human rights issues and try to minimize the impact that your business has on human rights. And again, this is similar to some of the other topics where this is not just about your own operations, but this is also something where you're being asked to consider how it impacts your procurement decision making and your supply chain as well. So that was an incredibly quick run through of the requirements. I did not get into any of the like finer details of what's asked under each because, as I mentioned, that would take so much more time than we have together today. But I did just want to give you kind of a first look, a glimpse, if you're not already familiar with what's being asked of you across the seven impact topics and the foundation requirements, just given that it is a really wide breadth of information that you'll need to be managing, collecting, making sure you're meeting all the requirements that are relevant to your business. And having that understanding is kind of critical to getting started, as we will talk about later when we talk through the process itself. A couple of things you might have heard me mention throughout that I want to drill down on before we get into the process about the V2 standards, which is that each impact topic has requirements and sub-requirements, and they're tailored by organization size and sector. So this is something where there is a certain amount of kind of tailoring, customization, if you will, of the requirements against what each company looks like to make sure that you're responding to the requirements that are most relevant to your business. So for sectors, this is broken down to agriculture, manufacturing, services with minor footprint, services with significant footprint, and wholesale retail. And so in some cases, certain requirements only apply to certain sectors. And in some cases, that's broken down even further where there are industries within a sector that certain sub-requirements apply to specifically. The next is on company size, and this is maybe one of the most important things to understand. You'll have heard me mention that there are maybe more requirements or different requirements if you're a large, an XL, or a double XL business. Um, that's because, again, there's this tailoring aspect of making sure that what is being asked of companies is in line with, what that company might actually be facing, what's most relevant to them. So for company sizes, this is where we've got double XL all the way down to companies without workers, and you can determine that using number of FTEs or revenue. You take the smaller of the two numbers you see here to determine what exactly your company size is to determine the appropriate requirements. And then the other thing I'll flag is that the V2 standards have continuous improvement built in, which is not necessarily something that was in the V1.6 requirements. To get to certification, you have to be in compliance with all the year zero sub requirements, as they're called. That's your certification year. But then there are some sub requirements that are required in, say, year three, where once you hit your third year, you have to be in compliance with those year zero requirements as well as the year three requirements. And then there's also year five requirements, right? That they all kind of build on each other over time to have that continuous improvement as time goes on once you hit your next certification cycle. All right. Now I will hand it over to Yimui to talk through B Corp certification and practice.
Thanks, Samantha. Brilliant. We've now covered the key changes introduced under V2. So the rest of the webinar will really focus on what implementation can look like in practice. So to help organizations navigate this transition, we have developed a practical 5-step implementation methodology, which we typically use to support organizations throughout the B Corp process. It will, of course, be tailored to your specific circumstances of your organization. So one thing to mention is just that while these steps align closely with the certification journey described at the beginning of the webinar, they focus on the activities that organizations need to take practically, from understanding applicable requirements, identifying gaps, through to implementing these management systems, preparing the evidence to verification readiness, and then beyond looking at embedding continual improvement. So if we start at step 1, we know that the V2 standards differ significantly from the previous ones. So before any changes are implemented, it's important to understand exactly what applies to your specific organization. So as Samantha had mentioned, starting with understanding their foundation requirements and then subsequently which of the 7 impact topics apply to you. That is the start of your B Corp process. So the objective at this stage is really to understand what applies, agree your certification scope, and define your ambition. Look at identifying the right people across your business to start supporting with those implementation processes. And rather than starting from scratch, what most organizations will already have are certain governance processes, policies, and ESG initiatives already in place that can have and set a strong foundation for the next steps. So by the end of this first stage, what you should have is a clear understanding of what are the applicable requirements to you, what is the agreed project scope, and who on a high level or initial thought is the right cross-functional team that you might want to involve before you move on to the next gap analysis step. So while many of organizations can lead this stage internally, sometimes external support can also be helpful in doing, for example, a full interpretation of the standards and help validate applicability, identify certain certification risks earlier on. So once you understand what requirements apply to your organization, the next step is then to assess where you stand today versus what are the gaps that need to be addressed. And what we recommend doing is carrying out a structured gap analysis. So we've got a little example on a very high level on the slide here. But essentially, for every applicable requirement under the 7 impact topics, you'll want to ask yourself questions like, do we already have the required process in place? Is it consistently implemented? And can we demonstrate that implementation through objective evidence? What this allows you to do is establish your current state baseline, and it can also help you distinguish earlier on between areas of the business that may already have a more mature management system in place versus other areas where further development and work is needed. And at the same time, you want to also begin identifying where evidence may be missing or insufficient, as understanding these evidence gaps early will help make the assurance process much more efficient. The next step is looking at prioritization. So, yes, thank you. So we recommend evaluating actions when you look at the requirements based on their impact on certification, versus the level of effort required to implement them. So something like a simple impact versus effort approach or matrix can help you really focus on which activities will deliver the greatest benefits while making the best use of your available resources. And what this can also do is help provide an opportunity to really balance those quick wins with longer term initiatives. So for example, really ensuring the mandatory year zero requirements are prioritized, but not neglecting planning for the future year three and year five. And one last thing to mention is the level of effort will vary across the different requirements, as you'll see. While some gaps can be addressed internally, others may require more specialist expertise. So, for example, you may find that external support can be helpful in helping to prioritize your actions or develop a phased implementation roadmap, or where you need additional technical guidance on more complex requirements, such as materiality assessments and climate transition planning. So really part of this step is also looking at which are the things that you can do internally and lead internally without external support versus others that you may realistically need external help on. And so the final output from this stage is ideally somewhat a implementation roadmap, with it clearly defining what are the requirements need to be addressed, what are the priorities, who the owners are for each task, and providing a structured plan for the next implementation phase. So step three is with the agreed prioritize identify, you now shift your focus to implementing these requirements across your organization. So to make this a little bit more practical, we have used an example from a climate action topic to describe this stage. So imagine your gap analysis has identified that your organization doesn't yet meet requirements relating to emission reduction targets. So if we break this down into 5 sub-steps, the first thing you want to do is define your objective. So in this example, that can look like, what is an appropriate target framework and how do we plan to develop and achieve those targets? Then you look at designing the approach. So this means, for example, establishing how will your emissions be measured, monitored, reported annually, and thinking about putting the policies, procedures, and governance in place to help support the development and delivery of your targets. So having certain practical templates and understanding leading practice or recognized frameworks, for example, can help accelerate this stage and process, of course. So with that, then you go into embedding those processes into day-to-day operations. So thinking about integrating emissions measurement, target monitoring into business practices, for example, embedding climate considerations into procurement and business planning, and ultimately ensuring the activities become part of routine operations. And then lastly, successful implementation also requires clear accountability. So thinking about assigning process owners, establishing board oversight, engaging your stakeholders, conducting internal training to help people understand their roles and help them adopt new processes as part of the normal business operations, or rather than thinking it as a siloed, standalone sustainability initiative. The ultimate goal here is to establish a management system that can be consistently implemented, evidenced during assurance, and then maintained throughout the certification cycle. And while this is an example for climate action, if we go to the next slide, the same implementation process can realistically be applied across any of the impact topics. So here on this slide, there's just a quick flash on the JEDA example, where here the objective might be to create a more equitable, inclusive workplace. So again, you still go through those processes by understanding the requirements, designing the policies, procedures needed, and then from there, implementation can look like, for example, updating onboarding processes, strengthening feedback mechanisms, and then providing appropriate training and embedding those practices into day-to-day operations. So while the specific requirements may change across each impact topic, when you look at the sub-requirements, the overall process can remain the same. And the last step before entering into independent assurance is that, of course, organizations need to demonstrate that they are verification ready. So one of the emphasis on V2 is having objective evidence. So what you have is under every applicable sub-requirement, you'll need evidence that demonstrates that not only a policy or process exists, but proof that it has been implemented, and also where required is operating effectively. So examples of certain evidence can include approved policies, documented procedures, training records. The BLab website actually provides a long, non-exhaustive list of evidence examples there. And one thing that I want to highlight is just the emphasis is on quality rather than providing as much as evidence as possible. So a couple of best practices is good evidence should be always current and specific to your organization and also verifiable. So for example, if a requirement asks you to conduct an assessment, the evidence should demonstrate clearly the assessment process itself, but not simply the outcome. And one last thing to suggest is before submitting your assessment, we would recommend carrying out an internal readiness review. So questions you can think about are, can you clearly demonstrate implementation, right? Is your evidence complete? Is it current? Is it easy to locate? So having these pre-verification review ready can help you really identify any remaining gaps before you enter the formal assurance process with BLab. And then lastly, I know we're actually really close to time, so I'll quickly wrap this up. So the final stage of the implementation journey is about verification and continual improvement. This diagram on the slide illustrates what to anticipate next. So following certification, you will address any remaining corrective actions and then move into an ongoing cycle of monitoring and review. So ensuring that performance continues to be measured and your management systems remain effective. So essentially, having these insights can drive your continual improvement. And as organizations mature, they will consistently integrate these improvements into your governance and decision making as well as business planning. So ultimately, help prepare yourself towards your year 3 surveillance and year 5 certification as well. So with that and 3 minutes left, I'll hand back over to Samantha, who will summarize today's key messages.
Yes, thank you. I know, as mentioned, we can talk forever about this. So took, I think, a little longer than we had originally hoped to get through some of this content. Appreciate all of you taking the time to stay with us. I'm gonna launch a poll to get some thoughts from you all in terms of what impact topic or topics would you want a deeper dive on in the future. As mentioned, we could spend so much time on that, and we didn't really get to go too deep today. And what feels most uncertain to you about the standards themselves? What would be helpful, to maybe get more insight on in future webinars or content? All right. I will also take us to the Q&A. Thank you all so much for sticking with us. We've got time for maybe a question or two as the poll is up. I'll leave that open while we get to some Q&A. All right, so let me pull the Q&A up, see what we've got. All right, let's start here. How far in advance do you recommend companies start working towards certification? I know, Yim, we mentioned at the beginning that the certification process is estimated to take 2 to 6 months, but that's for like the actual certification itself. We would recommend starting really as soon as possible. Some of the requirements and sub-requirements can take a lot of time to complete if you're not already working on them. So really starting now, at least with some of those first steps that we talked through, to understand which requirements are applicable to your company is key. So you know how much time it will take to fill gaps you may have before kind of going through that full certification process with the B Lab. Yimi, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. The gap analysis is definitely the first step that we would recommend. I think typically B Lab also recommends like 6 months or up to a year to prepare. So definitely identify where your priorities are, and then that can help you figure out how long it would take to meet those requirements.
Great. All right. Let's pull up. I think we've got time. Maybe one more question I can squeeze in before we get to time. All right. All right. Should we do all the requirements, e.g., doing a materiality assessment, or just accept that during the audit it will be flagged and address it after the audit? That's a great question. I think our recommendation would be to try and do all your requirements in advance of the audit, rather than going in and knowing nonconformities will be flagged as much as you can, especially for something like a materiality assessment that can take quite a bit of time, to maybe go through that process and get a materiality assessment done. So our recommendation is to try and meet as many requirements as you can before you go through the audit. Because ideally, once you get to the audit stage, it's kind of smooth sailing at that point. But of course, there might be some smaller items where it might make sense, to kind of go in knowing you'll need to kind of work on those as you're going through the audit process. But for some of the larger pieces, like a materiality assessment, we would definitely recommend tackling that before you get to the audit.
Yeah, just to add something on that is that once it's flagged as a major nonconformity, for example, during the audit process, you have a limited time to address those. So 6 months for major nonconformities, for example. So then you're bound to kind of a time frame. So definitely address as much as possible earlier, as Samantha suggested, would be the recommendation.
Yes. All right. We are at time. We're even a minute over. I really appreciate everyone who stayed on. I know we didn't get to all the questions. We'll try to follow up with folks directly if you've kind of put your name on a question so that we can, answer them as best we can. Once again, thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time and be on the lookout for follow up with, today's recording as well. Thanks all.